Let's do it.
This is the SEC Insider Hit. And it's presented by Blue Cross Blue Shield of Mississippi. It's good to be blue.
All right. We'll be heading to Starkville, Mississippi later today for the Stark Vegas NCAA Baseball Regional. They'll play tomorrow at 2 o'clock in Starkville as they host a regional. They're a national seed, number 7 national seed in the country. And Ole Miss also hosting a regional with Southern Miss in it and Florida State. And Ole Miss will play tomorrow night in their game one. They chose to play the night game. MSU chose to play the day game at their place. So it should be a wild weekend, packed stadiums in 100% capacity, all that kind of stuff. It's going to be bananas in Stark Vegas and Oxford. Check out Two Brothers Smoked Meats, great restaurant and bar in Starkville in the historic Cotton District right off campus. Pre-game and post-game throughout the weekend. Two Brothers Smoked Meats, fantastic restaurant and bar in Starkville, Mississippi. Our guests join us on the Modelo guest line. We welcome in Steve Palazzolo, Pro Football Focus, PFF.com. Steve, if Julio Jones, let's just say he lands with the Tennessee Titans, and they already have A.J. Brown, who's unbelievable, and Derrick Henry looks like he's got another year or two, and Tannehill's solid plus. What kind of impact could that have on their team, and where would you put them in the pecking order, like before he's on the roster and then after he's on the roster in the AFC?
First off, I thought you were going to segue into all of my Division II College World Series exploits and I was a hero one weekend in the Division II Northeast Regionals back in 2002. I thought we were going to start there, but okay, we'll start with Julio. With the Tennessee Titans, their group of playmakers is really just AJ and nobody right now because they let Corey Davis walk, they let Jonnu Smith walk at tight end. I mean, if you took A.J. Brown off that team, it is literally the worst group of receivers and tight ends in the NFL. And I just ranked them the other day, I think 27th, and that's what A.J. does. So they're just massive question marks. Josh Reynolds, who's basically a 3 or a 4 wide receiver, is slated to start opposite A.J. Brown. So that's why I tweeted the other day, the Titans need Julio more than anybody else. So if they get him, all of a sudden, okay, now that's a top 10 group of pass catchers. There's still a few question marks, and I think the ideal scenario for a team is to have at least 3 legitimate threats, and the Titans would still be lacking there. But, man, you have Julio Jones, maybe the next Julio Jones type of player in A.J. Brown. That's a fantastic combination. And I used to always joke on the podcast last year that they got the dudes. They have the dudes who just take over, and that's what A.J. does. That's what Derrick Henry does. They just have these incredible athletes and, high-end players that can take over games, and they would obviously add another to the mix with Julio. So, I think it's a much needed addition for the Titans. I think they need Julio Jones more than any other team.
Where do you think he'll land, Steve?
I think the Titans make sense. I know the Patriots are in there and the 49ers are digging around in there. And that would be incredible to get him back with Kyle Shanahan. But look, I've said on the show before, I don't think a non-quarterback moves the needle as much as, people think.
Sure.
But a high-end receiver does, because you do really need to have 3 or 4 legitimate threats. So think about Julio in, say, Seattle with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett, or in San Francisco with George Kittle and with Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. Just look at what that does for how the defense has to defend them. He is just such a valuable commodity out there right now. I think ultimately it's the Titans because I view them as the most desperate. If they go into the season with A.J. Brown and that other group of playmakers, I think the Titans are a 500 type of team.
Okay, Steve Palazzolo, NFL podcast, PFF.com. He joins us on the Modelo guest line. And the reason why you think that a high-end, super talented wide receiver moves the needle outside the quarterback position, and most other guys do not, is because bottom line it for me. At PFF, it's all about playmakers that can stretch the field?
Yeah, it's more. I always like to compare building a receiving core to. I'm stealing this analogy, but like building a basketball team, right? You've got a center who can post up and rebound. You have a big power forward who's going to be a rebounder. You've got some shiftier, quicker guys, and so you want to have this variety of playmakers. And then you have a guy like Julio legitimately does it all because you've got a defense that either wants to play man coverage and has to pick matchups. Or you have a defense that simply can't allocate all of their coverage players to one or two people. So that's why the impact of one great receiver is huge. But I think the value in the NFL is really having those multiple playmakers. And then if you look at the way the NFL has won, over the last 10 years, we've talked about this a million times. There's a handful of elite quarterbacks,
right?
And they could always use more playmakers, but generally they're going to produce. But the majority of the league is a guy like Matthew Stafford or Kirk Cousins or guys that you have to put really good playmakers around them, and that'll elevate them. It'll elevate them statistically. They're good. They're solid players. But if you want to get high-end production, you need that group of playmakers. So that's why having a good receiving core, a group of pass catchers, is probably the next most valuable thing right after the quarterback in today's NFL.
Why has Belichick rejected this? I mean, and I say that they've had a lot of success throwing the football with Brady and a number of guys, as you know, switching them in and out. Now, I mean, they've had some talented dudes come through, Randy Moss and Gronk and Hernandez and so on, but they've done it with some, just kind of solid dudes too. So I know they put up great numbers, but in a way with this shift the last decade, but where they are right now and what he may not have done for Brady, whatever, is Belichick kind of rejecting this paradigm shift of what you just described, Steve?
I think he has to a point, but I love looking at the Patriots dynasty as this 20-year picture, and I think it's a really good picture for the Kansas City Chiefs to look at as they perhaps prepare to be that next dynasty, right? I think Belichick believes in that philosophy. Yeah, I don't need to grab these great receivers, but it's because he's had Tom Brady. It's because Brady was able to elevate, David Gibbons and David Patton early in that dynasty, right? They were winning Super Bowls with just this bottom-of-the-barrel group of receivers, but it did catch up to them at one point. And if you look at the years where the Patriots, they were always in the playoffs, they were always in the AFC Championship, but there were certain years where it just didn't feel like they could compete. They just didn't have the firepower. And that was the issue. It wasn't because the offensive line necessarily fell apart. It was because their pass catchers fell apart, or he was throwing to Rashae Caldwell as his number one wide receiver and Jabbar Gaffney in 2006. Well, the Patriots pivoted and said, all right, that's it. We're getting Randy Moss. We're getting Wes Welker. We're not going to let that happen again. And then in 2013, they let it happen again. And Brady was throwing to all these undrafted free agents. And, that was a mess. It wasn't a great season there. But then the next year, Gronk came back healthy and Edelman was there. And they bring in Brandon LaFell. So I think the Patriots, tried to say, oh, Tom will take care of it. But if there was a few times they had a bottom five group of pass catchers, and it really came back to bite. So Belichick might believe in that philosophy, but if he goes back to the teams that won, he generally had a good group of pass catchers when we're talking about these teams in the last 10 years or so.
Fair enough. Steve Palazzolo, host of PFF NFL Podcast. You can obviously find that on Apple Podcasts, among other platforms. And then, of course, PFF.com. He joins us on the Modelo guest line. Y'all rank the wide receiver units in the NFL, and Dak's unit, the Cowboys, they come in at number 2. Right, Steve?
Yeah, they did. I did that ranking, so you could blame me if you think I'm off with anything.
No, I like it. I do. I mean, look. Here's Amari Cooper is really good, but he's not one of the top 5, 6, 7, 8 in the league. Am I right or am I wrong, Steve?
No, he's not that high. It's the combination of that trio, though. It's
right.
Cooper, it's Michael Gallup, and it's CeeDee Lamb. I think CeeDee Lamb could be at Amari Cooper's level as early as this year, and that makes Michael Gallup. Michael Gallup is a really good number 2. And if he's your number 3, that again, I sometimes I lean on that depth, and there's a fair discussion. Would you rather have the Cowboys trio and, they're a couple okay tight ends, or the Chiefs superstars, right? Tyreek Hill, Travis Kelce, 2 guys, but big question marks beyond them. And we saw what happened with the Chiefs. That wasn't just the offensive line falling apart in the Super Bowl against Tampa Bay. It was the fact that they only had 2 guys. Even the entire playoff run, they only had 2 guys who were really making an impact. Mecole Hardman's an okay. He's a good number 3. He's explosive. You got to account for him. But I just think that Dallas trio is the best in the league. The tight ends are reasonable enough. Cedric Wilson's an okay number 4 receiver. So I like the depth in Dallas. And when I look at Amari Cooper, he's not Julio. He's not that type. He's not an A.J. Brown take over the game type. But he gets open, and it's one of the more underrated parts of being a receiver. The guy just knows how to run routes and get open for the most part, and sometimes that is the most important thing, but it goes overlooked when it comes to receiver play.
And so you're expecting a pretty big jump for CeeDee Lamb this year, because Dak went out in what game, Blake? 5? Okay. You're expecting a pretty big – and for our listeners, CeeDee Lamb, first-round pick 2 years ago out of Oklahoma, and
yep.
really played well last year. They went through a up-and-down deal, but you're expecting him to take a big step this year.
Yeah, because in that draft class, now Justin Jefferson from the Vikings has become essentially the best wide receiver from that class after year 1. But I thought coming out, it was CeeDee Lamb, it was Jerry Jeudy from Bama, Henry Ruggs. I thought Lamb looked like the best all-around receiver that you could put outside. He could work the back shoulder game, really good route runner, and good after the catch. And Dallas put him in the slot last year. He had the second most yards in the slot last season, which is a favorable alignment for receivers. They tend to produce there. So I think Lamb, no matter where they put him, will be really good. He'll take a step forward. It'll feel more like a 1A and a 1B with him and Amari Cooper. And then you look at Gallup, and he'll be, again, I think just probably the best number 3 receiver in the NFL. And then they'll probably end up trying to move on from Gallup and figure out how to keep Amari and Lamb together. But I just love that group together. I think their potential with Dak throwing the ball is through the roof.
Are you ready to state unequivocally that Tony Pollard's better than Zeke Elliott?
Oh, I thought we were going to get the Dak MVP. I thought it was going to be like.
Well, that's already a done deal. We already made that decision.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. We're good.
I thought Tony Pollard was better than Zeke after his first carry. I thought it's the nature of the running back position. Is Zeke more talented? Absolutely. Does it matter on the field? Not really. As far as the difference between 4.5 yards per carry and 4.3 yards per carry, it just doesn't show up. And even if it does, it's 0.2 yards per carry. It doesn't move the needle. So, Pollard should be getting a few more touches. He's a weapon in the pass game as well. And, I think he'll start stealing some more Zeke snaps even when they're both healthy this year.
I hope so. Steve Palazzolo, NFL Insider, PFF.com. Great website. Pro Football Focus on the NFL and college ball. Blake, do you have a question? All right. Before we do that, here's how I see it with Steve Palazzolo. If he was a general manager, let's say he had 10 picks in the draft, 8 of them would be wide receivers.
It's not that crazy. There are people at PFF that would do that, and I'm not that extreme. I think starting – so I always joke about – I always compare it to Major League Baseball. Like the third starter in baseball was always this guy who got paid a ton just to be like average or whatever. But that's valuable. Like you need that guy.
Right.
In football, you need starters, right? You don't want to be bad anywhere. And those guys sometimes come at a price, offensive tackles and guards and defensive tackles and the whole thing. So you do have to spend your draft capital there. But, man, if you're trying to hit a home run, it is about loading up on receivers, tight ends, and guys that defenses can't cover.
A.J. Brown, that was 2 drafts ago. Was it 2 drafts ago or 3? But all right, so he was drafted in the second round. Is he the best, most productive wide receiver out of that draft, Steve, or do you know off the top of your head?
It's him and DK, right? I mean, both
yes.
of those guys, and they were 1 and 2 on our draft board. The fact that I love Deebo Samuel. I think he's productive in a different way, in that Shanahan system. But
tell me what that means when you say, because we're all familiar with Deebo Samuel out of South Carolina, Will Muschamp likes to ruin really good offensive skill players. So how is he productive in a different way? Like, walk me through that.
Yeah, so in Kyle Shanahan's system in San Francisco, they use a ton of that jet sweep stuff, and Deebo Samuel is that guy. You know, he's that guy that they get a lot of screens and short passes. He's averaged almost 10 yards after the catch per reception, and that's because, you know, short passes, and then he creates after the catch. And then if you do line him up out wide, he can run some of the traditional wide receiver routes. He's good, he's solid, he's competitive, and again, really good after the catch, even on, say, like dig routes, those deep in cuts and everything. So Samuel's just a really good offensive weapon, whereas you would look at A.J. Brown and say, okay, he's a more traditional wide receiver. We're going to line him up, and he's just going to run the whole route tree and dominate, right? And DK is, I would say, a more of a limited route tree. I don't want to overstate that, but yeah, he's running go routes. He's running down the field stuff, deep over routes and slants, and that's Seattle's really tapped into his skill set really well. So yeah, they're all productive in their own different way, which is traditional wide receiver versus just using DK's freak size and speed versus using Deebo's yards after the catch ability.
Would you compare Deebo Samuel to kind of Percy Harvin if Percy didn't have the issues that kind of stunted or didn't allow him to thrive at the professional level, Steve?
Yeah, there's an element to there. I mean, people have been making Percy Harvin comparisons for years, and I think what made him so unique is you saw the shiftiness. I think we can all see that watching TV. It's like, wow, the guy cuts incredibly, but Percy had just incredible power. I mean, he was a strong guy with the ball in his hands, before the ball. So Deebo is similar to that. He's got some just tenacity to him that you saw it at South Carolina a lot, where he was like, I'm just picking up these yards. I'm just going to do it. So yeah, there are definitely some similarities there. Even more similar, though, is how Deebo's been used. Like I said, all over the formation and as this offensive weapon that defenses don't know where he's going to line up. So there's definitely a lot of Percy to his game, even just in usage pattern as well.
Steve Palazzolo, PFF.com. Blake, you want to jump in here?
Yeah, so you mentioned...
Don't nerd out too much. Let's talk about something our listeners know about, too.
I wanted to break down
I don't care.
Now he's going to ask about my college baseball career.
There we go.
Yeah, I was going to ask about your college baseball career because I've seen videos you pitching, and I haven't swung a bat in a while, but I go yard. No, what my real question was, you mentioned wide receiver talent, and so it made me think about this. That we've talked about New Orleans. Obviously, we're a huge New Orleans town, and so the Saints have had weapons, but it's been a unique usage, especially over the last 3 years with Drew Brees basically not being able to throw a football 20 yards. So what do the Saints actually have weapon-wise? Because now they're going to open this offense up in a new way with Jameis Winston, who we assume everyone's telling us is the starter for the foreseeable future this season. What's that offense going to look like, and what weapons do they really have outside of a Michael Thomas who is built for Drew Brees, maybe not for Jameis Winston?
Yeah, I think they have one of the worst groups of playmakers in the league. I mean, Michael Thomas is awesome. I know people joke and hate on him on Twitter for some reason because he runs a lot of slants, and it's like, all right, the guy just moves the chains. And I don't want to use this word as this isn't a derogatory term, but he's one of the best possession receivers in the NFL. That's not a knock, but the guy just moves the chains, right? You need a 3rd and 8, he's going to pick up 8 or 9, right? I mean, that's what Michael Thomas does. So he's great. But again, going back to this basketball team thing, who's the guy that you're going to that you need to account for on the other side, or who's the guy that defenses are worried about beyond Michael Thomas? And I think you have a Deontay Harris who's incredibly fast and speedy, but still more of a special teamer that's like a 3 or a 4 wide receiver as a deep threat. You have Traquan Smith, who's another guy who's probably better fit as a number 3 wide receiver. He's just been okay. And then it's a battle between Traquan Smith and who else? Marquez Callaway, Lil Jordan Humphrey, Jawan Johnson. It's a whole bunch of guys without a great track record that are trying to be that number 2 guy opposite Michael Thomas. And even at tight end, Jared Cook was pretty good over these last couple of years, even with him getting old. So Adam Troutman was good as a rookie, good run blocker. They're expecting him and Nick Vannett to be the guys at tight end. And when you stack that group up, if Michael Thomas gets hurt again, this might be the worst group in the NFL if Michael Thomas wasn't there, much like I'm talking about the Titans if they were to lose A.J. Brown. So I think it doesn't look great, I don't think, for the Saints on paper unless a few of those guys emerge.
Well, Who Dat Nation is ticked off at Steve Palazzolo now. So
sorry. Well, they can tell me. They can find me and tell me who's going to be that guy opposite Michael Thomas. I'm looking forward to that one.
Oh man, what if this?
Marcus Callaway's okay. He's a solid player.
Yeah, you're grasping at straws. I know you
rude
are.
awakening in New Orleans coming this fall.
What if they go like 6-10?
That's a legitimate. I mean, isn't that legitimate?
They're
Steve?
not used to that the last. I mean, I know they did that 3 years 7-9 run, but they're really not used to this. Steve, go ahead.
Here's my comparison. There was a point where the Philadelphia Eagles a few years ago, if we were just ranking their roster, it was top 5. But where their weaknesses were wide receiver and corner. And the Saints, I'm not saying their weaknesses at corner, but their second, number 2 corner is a big question, and receiver is a question. The rest of their roster is good, though. D-line, O-line, Jameis can be fine, but whatever. The most important positions are in that pass game. So there is a chance that the Saints are having a disappointing season because of weaknesses on the perimeter.
That's interesting considering how successful Loomis, Shawn, and Ireland have been. Okay. All right, well, we'll leave it there. That was a good hit there on a lot of A.J. Brown like that, a little bit Dak and the Cowboys. And Julio, this is his last shot. I mean, he's got to try to land somewhere and make a run because he doesn't want to retire without a title. I mean, it's probably going to happen because it's so hard to win it. But he's already made a ton of dough. What do you think, Steve? He's got another 2-3 years of pretty high-level play?
Yeah, the tricky part with receivers is sometimes they fall off a cliff maybe more than QBs. And we saw that with A.J. Green last year. A.J. Green and Julio, they've been coming at it together since they came into the SEC together back in, 2008 or whatever it was. So A.J. Green fell off last year. We saw Andre Johnson of the Texans just randomly fall off 1 year. So it's a team that picks up Julio. It's exciting. It's good on paper, but there is some risk attached too that you just kind of all of a sudden lose it as an aging wide receiver.
Okay, but you would. I've got 30 seconds. You would give a first if you felt like you needed him and he could move the needle in December and January, because this thing just comes down to a few plays and few possessions and blah blah blah. Would you even hesitate to give a first-round pick if you're the Titans? Or
I'd prefer a second, but if I'm if I'm the Seattle Seahawks, that is really intriguing. Julio, DK Metcalf, and Tyler, it moves the needle huge for a team like the Seahawks to add Julio to the mix.
Yeah, see, I don't need that's in the NFC. So we got to focus on the AFC because Dak is in the NFC.
Tennessee.
Right. So Tennessee. All right, be good, Steve. Have a good weekend, man.
All right. Thank you, guys. Appreciate it.
Steve Palazzolo on the Modelo guest line, PFF.com. He's the NFL. He's the host of their NFL podcast, Pro Football Focus. You can find it everywhere. Apple Podcast, among the other platforms. We're live in the Bank Plus studio. Bank Plus, it's more than a name, it's a promise. That's where I met Drew Brees with the Bank Plus crew in 2000, I guess 6 or maybe 7. Good grief, that training camp was hot. Holy Mary Olzep. But, that's when Sean Payton moved the Saints up to Millsaps. It's in the book that Jeff Duncan writes about. I mean, he writes about Payton and Brees and why Sean wanted to move. It wasn't just Katrina. Why Sean wanted to move the Saints out of the New Orleans area. It's a really good book. The Out of Bounds Show is brought to you by the New York-style pizza at Sal and Mookie's, now in the district in Eastover. Sal and Mookie's new location, the district in Eastover. Show is also presented by Ace Bolt and Screw, powered by DeWalt.